Winifred Ashford folded her husband's letter in half, then in half again, and set it on the parlor table with the same careful attention she gave to everything in that house. The cut flowers she arranged every Monday. The household accounts she balanced to the penny. The social calendar she maintained, so that Arthur Ashford's professional standing never suffered for want of a well-placed dinner party. She did not throw the letter. She did not cry. She simply set it down and stood at the window and looked at the January street outside, where the lamplighter was making his evening rounds through the London fog, and understood, not for the first time, but for the last, exactly what she was to the man she had married. She was 24 years old. She had been Mrs. Arthur Ashford for 3 years, and she had spent those 3 years being exactly the wife a woman of her position was expected to be: capable, quiet, decorative when required, practical when useful. She had come to the marriage without illusions, or so she had told herself. It had been arranged, as most marriages in her circle were arranged, with practicality on both sides and sentiment nowhere in the negotiation. Her father had debts. Arthur Ashford had a solicitor's practice that needed a certain kind of wife to round out its respectability. She had understood the transaction. She had accepted it. What she had not understood, not fully, was the particular quality of invisibility that would follow. She had tried in the beginning to make something real of it. She had read the books Arthur mentioned at dinner, so she could discuss them. She had learned the names of every partner at his firm and their wives and their preferences at table. She had managed the household with the efficiency of a woman twice her age, reducing costs in the first year by nearly a third, without touching anything Arthur would notice. She had thought, and this was the part that shamed her now, standing at that window, she had thought that competence might eventually produce regard. It had not. She had learned the shape of her husband's indifference the way you learn the layout of a dark house. By running into things. The letter on the table had not been written to her. It had been written to his colleague Pemberton, and she had found it slipped inside a brief she had been asked to file. Arthur sometimes used her as an unpaid clerk when his secretary was occupied, which was its own kind of statement, though he had never seemed to recognize it as such. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The third paragraph was the one that mattered. In it, Arthur described his domestic arrangements, with the tone of a man explaining a particularly efficient piece of equipment. He mentioned, by name, the money her father's situation had allowed him to avoid. He mentioned, in a subordinate clause, that she had turned out to be more manageable than he'd anticipated, which he attributed to her lack of romantic expectations at the outset. He mentioned, finally, that Pemberton ought to consider a similar arrangement for himself, as a woman with something to lose made a far more tractable wife than one who had options. Manageable. Winifred stood at the window for a long time after reading that word. She watched the lamplighter move down the street, and she thought about the 3 years behind her, and she felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but something colder and more clarifying than either. The feeling of a woman who has just been handed, by accident, the exact truth she had been too careful to look for directly. She turned from the window. She went to her writing desk. Her mother's writing desk, the one piece of furniture in this house that had come with her, rather than been assigned to her, and she sat down and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, behind a row of correspondence files, was a small leather case. Inside the case was £43 and some shillings, assembled over 18 months from the household budget. Not stolen, redistributed. She had made the house run on less than Arthur allocated and kept the difference in a denomination he would never think to look for. She had not known, when she started doing it, exactly why she was doing it. She knew now. She also knew something else. Something she had been pushing to the edge of her mind for nearly a year. Her mother's sister, her Aunt Constance, had died the previous winter and left her a small bequest. A cottage in Derbyshire, a modest but functional property that Winifred had inherited in her own name because Constance had never married, had no male heirs, and had possessed the unusual foresight to consult a solicitor about keeping it that way. Arthur had mentioned the inheritance once, in passing, and said the property would need to be sold as they had no use for it. He had not actually sold it. He had not, in point of fact, done anything with it at all, because it was hers, not his, and the law, in this particular case, had arranged itself in a way that even Arthur Ashford's professional fluency could not fully undo. She had not mentioned it again. Neither had he. The cottage had sat in a county she had never visited, belonging to her in a way that very little else in her life currently did. She sat at the writing desk for a long time, not moving, just thinking. Then she opened the desk's top drawer and took out a piece of paper and wrote a single letter. Not to Arthur. Not to her father. To a woman named Olive Fenwick, who had been her closest friend before marriage had redistributed their lives, and who now ran a small private lending library in Derby, 40 minutes from the cottage by rail, and who had written to Winifred twice in the past year with the particular tone of a woman leaving a door open. The letter was short. It said she was coming. It said she did not know exactly when. It said she hoped the office still stood. She sealed it before she could reconsider. Arthur came home at 8:30, as he usually did on the evenings. Pemberton dined with him, carrying the particular expansiveness of a man who has spent several hours being professionally admired. He came into the parlor and looked at the mantel clock, and looked at Winifred, and said, without particular feeling, that he hoped she'd eaten. She said she had. He said something about Parliament. She responded appropriately. He poured himself a brandy, and read the evening paper, and did not notice the letter on the table, though it was in plain sight. He did not notice it, because he had never developed the habit of noticing what she left in rooms, on the grounds that whatever she left was simply there, the way the furniture was there, fulfilling its function. She watched him read the paper and felt nothing she hadn't felt before, but she felt it differently now. The way a room looks different when you understand you are about to leave it. She went upstairs at 10 o'clock, as she usually did. She took out the canvas traveling bag that had been her mother's, the one she had brought to this house on her wedding day, and never unpacked entirely, for reasons she had not examined closely until recently. She did not pack it tonight. She simply opened it, confirmed what was inside, and closed it again. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house. Arthur in the study below, the creak of his chair, the particular rhythm of a man who was entirely at ease. She had made this house comfortable enough that he was always at ease in it. She had done that. It had cost her a great deal, and he had never once asked what it cost. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling, and made a list in her head of everything that was hers. The writing desk, the leather case, the cottage. £43. One aunt's faith that she would need a door someday. She slept. She was up before Arthur, which was not unusual. She was always up before Arthur. She had spent 3 years being up before Arthur, so that the household presented itself in order before he descended. This morning she let the fire in the parlor grate go unlit. She let the breakfast things remain in the kitchen rather than being arranged. She dressed in her traveling clothes. The dark blue wool, the coat her mother had given her the winter before she died, and she went to the writing desk and picked up the leather case. She did not write a note. She had thought about a note. She had composed several in her mind over the past months, elegant and precise and devastating in the way that only true things are devastating. But she thought of Arthur reading them, and she thought of Pemberton reading them, because Arthur told Pemberton everything in the subordinate clauses of professional correspondence. And she decided that her words were worth more than that. They were not for him. They were for people who had earned them. She left through the front door, which she had never used to leave the house before. Always the side entrance, always the back, always the appropriately modest exit of a woman who understood her place. She used the front door this time, and she did not look back at the house. The morning was gray and cold, the way London in January is always gray and cold, with a damp that gets into everything. She walked to the cab stand at the corner, and took a cab to Euston Station, and at Euston Station she purchased a ticket to Derby with her own money, and she sat in the second-class carriage as the city fell away behind her, and the countryside opened up, grey-green and frost-edged, and she felt, somewhere around the first hour of the journey, the thing she had not let herself feel for 3 years. Not free, not yet. But moving, which was not the same thing, but was the necessary beginning of it. Olive Fenwick opened the door of the lending library before Winifred reached the step. She was a small woman, Olive, compact and brisk, with the particular energy of someone who had built their own life from the ground up and found the process educational. She had known Winifred since they were girls at the same school in Bath, and she looked at her now, traveling bag over one shoulder, London soot still on her coat, the particular expression of a woman who has made an irreversible decision and is still measuring its weight, and she said, without preamble, "Come in, there's tea." Winifred came in. Olive did not ask questions. She poured tea and put bread on the table and let the silence do what silences do when they are between people who know each other well enough to let them. After a while she said, "The Hollow." Winifred looked at her. "That's what people here call your aunt's cottage." Olive wrapped both hands around her cup. Constance Vane's Hollow. She lived there 20 years, grew everything herself, kept bees. A pause. She was a remarkable woman. Everyone in the valley knew it. Winifred had not known her Aunt Constance well. Constance had left her family's world early, before Winifred was old enough to understand why, and had reappeared only at intervals. At Winifred's mother's funeral, at the edges of Christmas letters, in the form of occasional packages containing preserves, and once memorably, a very good book about botanical illustration that Arthur had called eccentric and Winifred had read 3 times. "I never visited her," Winifred said. "She expected you'd come eventually," Olive said. "She said so. She said the right circumstances would have to present themselves first." Something moved across Olive's face. "I think she meant to say that in a kinder way." But Constance was not always given to kindness when directness would do. Winifred thought about her aunt, whom she had barely known, looking at her niece's life from a distance and concluding that the right circumstances would present themselves, counting on it. Leaving a cottage to a woman she barely saw, because she believed in her sight unseen. "She left me the property," Winifred said. "Not him." "Yes," Olive said. She was very deliberate about that. Winifred's hands were entirely still around her cup. "Have you seen it?" "Many times. I keep an eye on it. Constance asked me 2 years ago before she died." Olive looked at her directly. "It needs work, not repair, exactly. It needs someone living in it who knows how to use it. Constance had a kitchen garden that's gone to seed and a root cellar that would take a week to inventory, and a room at the back she used for correspondence that she called her thinking room and that I've never fully understood the purpose of." Winifred almost smiled. "A thinking room," she said. "She had a great deal to think about," Olive said simply. "She was one of those women who did." Winifred looked out the window of the library at the narrow Derby Street, at the bookshop across the road, and the greengrocer and the women going about the morning with their baskets and their particular purposeful stride. It was a working town Derby, not London. Not trying to be. "I need to see a solicitor," she said. "Not Arthur's kind, my kind." Olive did not look surprised. "I know one," she said. "His name is Edward Carew. He handles property and estate matters, and he is not, crucially, on your husband's professional circuit." A pause. "He handled Constance's affairs. He's the one who helped her structure the bequest the way she did." Winifred looked at her. "How did she structure it?" "In such a way," Olive said carefully, "that the property could not be absorbed into a marital estate without your explicit, witnessed, notarized consent." Constance was, as I said, a deliberate woman. She had opinions about the Married Women's Property Act and the gap between what it said and what it actually did. The particular silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. It was the silence of a woman understanding, for the first time, the full architecture of a gift she had thought she understood. "She protected it," Winifred said. "She protected you," Olive said. "She just hadn't met you yet." Edward Carew worked out of an office above a chemist's shop on the edge of the market square, a spare, deliberate room that smelled of coal smoke and patience. He read Winifred's documents without speaking, and when he finished, he set them on his desk and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent many years learning to read what people don't say as efficiently as what they do. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "what is it you want to accomplish here?" It was such a clean question. Not what does your husband want? Not what does your father advise? What do you want to accomplish? She told him. She laid it out the way her father had once taught her to make a case for anything. Facts first, context after, nothing embellished. She told him about the cottage, the bequest, her aunt's intentions, and the 3 years during which Arthur had not sold the property, but had not acknowledged it belonged to her either. She told him about £43 in a leather case, and her own name on a deed that no one had ever challenged because no one had yet had cause. She did not tell him about the letter. She did not need to. The letter was not evidence of anything except the things she already knew. When she finished, Carew laced his fingers together and considered her. "Your aunt's bequest is structured correctly," he said. "It would require your explicit consent to transfer, and you have not given it. The property is, in legal terms, yours." He paused. "The complication is what your husband does when he realizes what you're doing. He'll try to make me come back," she said. "He'll try to make it professionally awkward not to," Carew said. "A solicitor with an errant wife is a particular kind of embarrassment in certain circles. He'll use that." "I know," she said. "He uses everything that way." Carew looked at her steadily. "May I ask you something directly? Please, are you certain you want to proceed?" "Not because I doubt you," he said before she could answer. "Because a woman who hesitates at this stage spends considerably more energy than a woman who has already decided." Winifred thought about the letter, folded on the parlor table. She thought about 3 years of invisible labor. She thought about her Aunt Constance, who had walked away from a life that didn't fit her in 1879 and spent 20 years growing things in a valley in Derbyshire and keeping bees and being by all accounts remarkable. I decided on the train, she said. Carew almost smiled. Then let's begin. She was 4 days in Derby. Long enough for Carew to begin filing the paperwork, long enough for Winifred to go with Olive to see the cottage for the first time, walking up a lane that was still edged with frost and ended in a low stone building with a green door and windows that faced the valley. The cottage was smaller than she'd pictured. Solidly built, the kind of construction that was intended to last, rather than impress. The kitchen garden had indeed gone to seed, but she could see what it had been. Structured, productive, designed by someone who understood how to make a piece of land work for her, rather than the reverse. The thinking room at the back was exactly what Olive had said. A room Winifred didn't fully understand yet, but recognized. In the way you recognize a word in a foreign language that you've never been taught, but heard somewhere once and stored. She stood in that room for a long time. Outside, the valley was bare and cold and entirely real, no performance in it, nothing arranged for the sake of appearances. She understood, standing there, that her aunt had not left her property. She had left her a practice, a way of being in the world that did not require anyone else's endorsement. She walked back into the kitchen and looked at the room with Olive and said, "I'm going to need help with the garden. And someone who knows the valley." "I know exactly the person," Olive said, in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for that sentence. The person was a woman named Cecily Marsh, who was 60 and had been Constance Vane's nearest neighbor and, as it turned out, her closest ally in a network of local women that Winifred had not known existed and was only now beginning to understand. Cecily ran the Women's Institute chapter in the next village and had what she called a practical knowledge of property law, which meant she had learned it the hard way through 30 years of watching women lose things they should not have lost. Cecily looked at Winifred with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to taking accurate measure of people quickly. "You're Constance's niece," she said. Not as a question. "I am. She talked about you," Cecily said. "She said you had your mother's mind and your own spine, and that the right circumstances would have to present themselves before you'd know it." A pause. She was right then. The right circumstances, again. Winifred was beginning to understand that a more strategic woman than anyone in her family had given her credit for. Perhaps that was why they hadn't given her credit. "Tell me about the network," she said. Cecily looked at her for a moment, then she sat down and did exactly that. What Cecily described was not formal, had no name, kept no official ledger. It was a pattern of assistants, women who knew which solicitors were fair, which landlords were not, which positions were available, which farms had room, which women in the county had skills nobody had thought to properly use. It was knowledge passed laterally, quietly, in the way that women have always passed knowledge when the official channels were not built for them. Constance had been part of it for 20 years. She had contributed what she was best at, keeping records, reading documents, writing the kind of clear, precise correspondence that cut through obstruction like a knife. What she could do that most of us couldn't, Cecily said, was make the legal language work. She understood it better than most solicitors, honestly, because she'd had to. She'd had to fight for what she had, and fighting teaches you the terrain. Winifred looked at the table, at the room, at the green door and the valley beyond. She was beginning to understand that she had not inherited a cottage. She had inherited a position. The letter came from Arthur on the 9th day. It was delivered through Carew's office, which was itself significant. It meant Arthur had discovered she was working with a solicitor and had chosen to respond in kind rather than in person. She recognized the tactic. Arthur processed everything through professional distance. Feeling was a liability. Management was a skill. The letter was 2 pages and entirely Arthur. Precise, measured, calibrated to produce a particular effect. He did not ask who he was. He did not express concern for her well-being. He enumerated, in clean legal language, the several ways in which her current situation was disadvantageous to her, and concluded by noting that his willingness to receive her back without formal censure was contingent on a response within the fortnight. Winifred read it once. Then she handed it to Carew and watched him read it. "He's not wrong about several of these," Carew said carefully. "I know," she said. "Which ones?" He told her. She listened. She had expected this and had been calculating since the train journey north what she had and what she didn't have. She had the cottage, which was legally protected. She had £43, which was not a fortune but was more than nothing. She had Carew, who was good, and Olive, who was loyal, and Cecily, who knew things. What she did not have was time. because Arthur's patience for situations outside his control was finite. He'll escalate, she said. Yes, Carew said. The question is in what direction. He'll contact my father, she said. Not to enlist him, to use him. He'll suggest that my behavior reflects poorly on the family, which is true in ways my father will care about, and he'll ask my father to intervene. My father will find it genuinely difficult to refuse, because my father's greatest fear has always been the appearance of impropriety. Carew looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as professional respect. You know him well. I've had 3 years to study him, she said. He's not complicated. He's just certain. What do you want me to do when your father contacts me? When he contacts you, she said, not if. Tell him the truth. Tell him I am at the cottage, that I am legally entitled to be there, and that his son-in-law's letter has been received and is under consideration. She paused. Tell him I am well. That's the part he'll actually want to know, whatever he says otherwise. Her father, Reginald, she stopped herself. He was not in this story the way she'd been about to tell it. He was peripheral, worried in the way of a man who loved his daughter imperfectly but genuinely, and had never known what to do with her particular quality of capability. He would be distressed. She was sorry for that. She was also done letting his distress be the wall she ran into. Carew sent the response to Arthur's letter on a Thursday. Winifred did not read the full text. She had given Carew the substance of it. That she was at the cottage, which was legally hers. That she was in good health. That she was prepared to discuss the formal dissolution of the marriage through proper legal channels, and that any further correspondence should come through his office. She spent the Thursday afternoon in the kitchen garden with Cecily, who was teaching her what Constance had grown, and where and why, walking the rows of frozen earth with the purposeful unhurriedness of a woman who understood that land has its own schedule and cannot be rushed. Cecily talked about the soil, about the valley's particular microclimate, about the apple trees at the eastern edge that no one had pruned in a year and would need attention in spring. She talked about it all the way her aunt had written correspondence, precisely, without embellishment, with the calm certainty of someone for whom the work itself was the point. Winifred listened and filed it away in the part of her mind that had always absorbed this kind of information without effort, the part that had balanced Arthur's household accounts, and organized his dinner parties, and run 3 years of domestic administration without a word of acknowledgement. She was beginning to understand that this capacity, the capacity she'd been pouring into his life, might belong in her own. Arthur came on a Saturday. Of course he came on a Saturday. Arthur was a man who understood the rhetoric of gesture, and arriving in person, rather than through correspondence, was the correct move at this juncture, and he would have calculated that. He came to the cottage alone, which surprised her. She had expected Pemberton, or someone else who could serve as witness and professional ballast. He came alone, on the first clear morning in a week, when the valley was briefly bright with winter sun and the frost in the garden had the particular quality of something beautiful that was about to disappear. Winifred was in the thinking room when Olive came to the door. She went to meet him in the kitchen, which was the right room for this conversation. Not the parlor, which didn't exist here. Not the front step, which was too exposed. The kitchen, which was where work happened, where things were functional and real. Arthur Ashford at the door of a stone cottage in Derbyshire looked like what he was. A man of the city in a place that did not require him. He was well-dressed, because he was always well-dressed. He was composed, because he was always composed. He looked at the cottage and at the kitchen and at Winifred and said, "You look well." She let that land without responding to it. "Arthur," she said, "come in." He came in. He looked at the room, the shelves, the dried herbs Cecily had shown her, the ledger she had started on the table for the cottage accounts. He looked at it all with the expression of a man taking inventory and finding the inventory unexpected. "You've made yourself at home," he said. "It is my home," she said. "Constance left it to me." He sat down across from her at the table because there was nowhere else to sit, and the kitchen table was where the chairs were. She had made it so deliberately. In Arthur's world, you conducted certain kinds of conversation standing because standing allowed for the subtle management of spatial authority. A kitchen table made everyone equal, and the conversation direct. "I'd like you to come back," he said. The words came out the way they always did with Arthur, precise, unemotional, as if he were presenting a reasonable proposal at a meeting rather than asking his wife to return to their marriage. "No," she said. He looked at her. Arthur Ashford was not a man who encountered that word often, and certainly not from her. In 3 years she had navigated around it rather than through it. For the same reasons she had not used the front door to leave, and had never told him she was saving money. She had been managing the landscape of his certainty, rather than confronting it directly. She was done managing it. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "The legal situation is not as clean as your solicitor may have suggested. There are aspects of the Married Women's Property Act that require—" "I understand the act," she said. "I read it. I also read the case law from the past 20 years, which Carew was kind enough to discuss with me in detail." She held his gaze steadily. "You are a solicitor, Arthur. You know I am correct about the cottage. The question is what you intend to do about it." Something shifted in his face. Not much, but she knew that face. She had studied it for 3 years the way you study a difficult text, and she saw it. The recalculation. "There are professional considerations," he said. "I know what the professional considerations are," she said. "A solicitor whose wife has left is a subject of conversation. That conversation reflects on you." She kept her voice even. "It would reflect on you considerably more if the circumstances were known. The letter to Pemberton, for instance." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had ever shared with her husband, which was saying something, because they had spent 3 years in the same house not speaking. "I didn't intend," he started. "I know what you intended," she said, not angrily, tiredly, "the way you say something you have had to think about for a long time, and have finally understood fully. You intended to manage me, because that is how you approach every problem. You find the most efficient structure and you maintain it. I was efficient. I was useful. You managed me the way you manage a well-organized brief, and you did it without ever once looking up to see if I was a person." Arthur was quiet. She had never spoken to him at this length about anything that mattered. "The letter," she continued, "said I was manageable because I had no romantic expectations. But that wasn't accurate. I had expectations. I just expressed them in ways you never looked at. In the household accounts, in the dinner parties that made your career easier, in the years I spent being quiet so you wouldn't have to listen." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I gave you a great deal, Arthur. I gave it because I thought I was supposed to, and then because I couldn't stop, and then because I had forgotten I had the option. I'm not angry about that anymore. I'm simply done." Something moved across his face. She had expected defensiveness. She had expected the professional composure clicking back into place like a lock. What she saw instead was something she had never seen there before. Not sorrow, not love, but something quieter and more honest than either. Something that looked like a man who has just been handed an accounting of a ledger he had not realized was being kept. "The cottage," he said finally. "Is mine," she said. "Carew files the formal claim next week. There is no counter-argument in law, and the marriage can be ended quietly," she said. "Or not quietly, I'd rather quietly, for both our sakes. But that decision is as much yours as mine." He looked at her for a long time. He looked, she thought, like a man in a room whose furniture has just rearranged itself while he was standing in it, trying to find where everything has gone. "I'll speak to Carew," he said. Not to her. Not quite a concession. Not quite a resignation. The tone of a man deciding that the next move is through proper channels. He stood. He picked up his hat from the edge of the table where he'd set it. He looked at the room one more time, the shelves, the ledger, the dried herbs, the thinking room door ajar at the back. "You've changed," he said. "I was always this," she said. "You simply never looked." He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her once, and for a single moment she saw on his face the nearest thing to actual feeling she had seen there in 3 years. Not regret, exactly, and not understanding, but the beginning of one, or perhaps both. The look of a man who has just grasped, too late, the full dimensions of something he had estimated far too small. He left. Winifred sat at the kitchen table and put both hands over her face and breathed. Her heart was going very fast. She had not let herself feel how fast her heart was going during the conversation, and now she let herself feel it. Olive appeared in the doorway from the hall. She had been in the next room, close enough if needed. She came and sat across from her and said nothing. After a moment Winifred lowered her hands. Her face was entirely dry. "He'll follow through," she said. "He'll contact Carew. He's a man of his word when his word is what's most convenient." "That'll do," Olive said. Winifred almost laughed. It came out as a breath, warm and real. She looked at the room, at the kitchen table that had been her aunt's, at the ledger open to a fresh page, at the window and the valley beyond it, frost still on the lower field. "The garden needs a structure," she said. "A proper plan, so it can be productive again." Olive looked at her. "I could draw one up with you." "And the thinking room," Winifred said. "I've been trying to understand what Constance used it for. I think I'm beginning to." The letter from Kara's office came 3 weeks later. Arthur had not filed a challenge. The cottage claim would proceed without opposition. In a formal letter through proper channels, he had agreed to discuss separation terms and had not proposed her return as a condition of anything. Winifred read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with Cecily across from her going over the kitchen garden plan, and a woman named Dorothea Mace sitting beside her. No, not that name. Another name. A younger woman, 20, who had arrived at Olive's library the week before with a situation Olive had described only as requiring a clearer head than she currently had, and who had, in the 3 days since, revealed herself to possess a precise and entirely untrained mind that Winifred recognized immediately. She set the letter down on the table. "Good news?" Cecily asked. "Yes," Winifred said. She looked at the letter and then at the room. At the woman across from her and the young woman beside her, and the window and the valley and the thinking room door. "Yes, I think so." She picked up her pen. There were things to organize, a property to register properly in her name, a garden to plan, a room to put to its intended purpose, a structure of assistance that her aunt had given 20 years to building, and that Winifred was only beginning to understand, from the inside, how it worked. She thought about Constance, whom she had barely known, who had walked away from everything that didn't fit and built something in its place, and who had believed, without evidence, without guarantee, without ever having sat in a room with her niece and tested the theory, that the right circumstances would eventually produce the right person. She had been right. She had always been right. Winifred began to write. Outside, the valley was hard and cold and entirely particular, belonging to itself, making no apologies. The frost on the lower field caught the morning light the day she arrived, and the day Arthur came, and every day since. The apple trees at the eastern edge stood bare and ready for the pruning that would happen in spring, and then, after that, the ordinary extraordinary thing that happened to every tree that was properly tended. They bore fruit. Not this season. Next. Some things required patience. Some things required preparation. Some things required a woman who had spent 3 years watching the pattern of another person's life and had finally learned to look at her own. Winifred looked at her own. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She wrote the name of the cottage beneath it. She wrote the things that needed doing and the order in which they should be done, and the names of the women who could help do them. And when she had filled the first page, she turned to the second. And outside the frost began to lift from the lower field as the morning warmed, and somewhere in the thinking room, the particular quality of the light coming through the east window was exactly what her aunt had meant by the name she'd given it. She had needed the right circumstances. Now she needed the work she began.